Um,
Hi, I'm Emma Hillman.
Hi, I'm Erich Hlawaty.
and our project that we'll be talking to you today is titled Integrating Electric Vehicle Charging into Distributed Energy Optimization and Aggregation for Advanced Energy Communities. Quite a mouthful, but we hope to unpack all of that for you today. We are working in partnership with DER NetSoft. They are a startup company based on the Bay Area, and they hope to develop or have developed some data analytic tools to help communities adopt distributed energy resources and aggregate these DERs into what we call an advanced energy community. So we want to step through some of the objectives, give you an idea of why this is important, provide some background into the literature review and facts we gathered, then walk you through the methodology of our rating index, and finally close out with a, so what, what's the implication of this? So I'll turn it over to Erich to jump through some of those objectives.
So thanks, Vinny. So like Vinny mentioned, we're working for DER NetSoft, a startup in the Bay Area. And what we're doing is developing a tool to rank a commercial and industrial site's ability to host electric vehicle charging stations as a distributed energy resource. And what the ultimate goal was to come up with a spreadsheet that ranks the predetermined sites that DER NetSoft gave us and rank them based on a series of categories and subcategories that we were determined would be optimal for comparing the sites against each other. The ultimate purpose of this Excel spreadsheet ranking tool is so that DER NetSoft can establish a methodology for scaling up this ranking scheme for distributed energy resources using a kind of mock city of San Leandro, as I previously mentioned, but to scale it up to other cities and localities across the country. And what their goal is to build kind of an AI neural network that can determine which sites are ideal for DER hosting of different assets. So the asset we were focused on was electric vehicles for this year. What they're looking for is kind of to determine which sites can be most feasible, and then approach cities, the sites themselves, DER vendors into applying and building these distributed energy resources, maximizing the full energy potential of the commercial and industrial sites.
So like we said, to break down some of these terms, a lot of you have experience in the industry, but if it's not clear, let's just, put this out there. Distributed energy resources, DER, what we mean by that is small energy generators, generally in the range of under 50 megawatts. And the difference here is that these are decentralized resources. They're not under the umbrella of a utility that's controlling, planning for them, and operating them. So on this chart here, you see on the left side, and connected by the gray lines, you've got a traditional grid centrally planned like it has been for many, many years. But, the up and coming changes in the utility landscape have introduced a lot of variability in the resources, more small distributed, decentralized resources. And that's what we're exploring. We're exploring the EVs in combination with solar, with storage, in what we're calling an advanced energy community. And what that is essentially rolling up these small units of power generation and load as well, managing them together and making decisions in a way that's optimal for that location's resources and that location's needs. And that's what DER NetSoft aims to do, is to be a data analytics provider, be a platform that aggregates all of that, gives you not only the intelligence you need to in terms of usage and how things are trending, but allow you to become more of a prosumer, as you call it, and as they call it, and eventually a market participator, like Erich was showing in that previous slide, really engaging the customer to allow them to benefit from the resources on site in a way that wasn't possible before.
So the driving force behind this Capstone project and also DRNetSoft's goal is to help communities adopt distributed energy resources so that they can reduce their greenhouse gas emission. So in 2009, San Leandro, which is the pilot city, adopted a climate action plan, and their ultimate goal was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% below 2005 levels by 2050. So as you can see in this figure below, this is from the city's report, commercial energy and residential energy over the past 10 years have decreased. However, you can see that transportation sector emissions have increased in San Leandro. In fact, San Leandro, their transportation sector is responsible for 60% of the city's emissions. So one of the actions that San Leandro addresses in their climate plans is to adopt more charging stations and incentivize businesses in the city to do so. But as you can see, they still need some help with doing that. So if they did adopt more electric vehicles in San Leandro, that can help reduce their transportation emissions.
And as Emma pointed out, transportation emissions are a huge part of the city's overall GHG emissions. And with San Leandro, it's kind of interesting because it's a city that's in, sort of a highway, so it gets a lot of throughput traffic, but a large chunk of the city emissions does come from employee commutes. The city has about 50,000 employees, and 90% of the workforce is commuting into the city day in and day out, according to census data. And a lot of those people are driving alone. Some of them are carpooling. And as we know from our literature research, if you think about deploying charging stations, it's often linked with adoption of EVs. And in California, being a progressive state, they're ahead of the curve in terms of adoption. But something that's been identified is that the adoption of EVs is going to be a key piece of, getting more people to jump on the bandwagon, reduce that range anxiety. And when you think about commuting, for the city of San Leandro, and this is data that's available for other places, on average, people are commuting about 35 miles for their commute. So we've identified that level 2 charging is the most appropriate for the workplace, getting, within the range of miles they need for a few hours of charging during the workday. And if you think about it, you're at work for 8 hours, sometimes 12 or more. But, so we've identified that could be the solution that we target in this community.
So as Vinny was mentioning, electric vehicle adoption can help California meet their climate action plan goals. So former California Governor Brown actually signed an executive order to increase the number of zero emission vehicles in California to 5 million by 2030. So as Vinny was saying, in order to get to this number of electric vehicles, you need to adopt charging stations. So another part of this executive order was to increase the number of charging stations in California to about 250,000 by 2025. So just to add how important it is to have electric vehicle charging stations, it's been shown in a lot of studies that not just charging stations have a better chance of increasing in electric vehicle sales than addressing other barriers such as cost and income. And in fact, in one company of a case study that we were looking at, they installed 50 workplace charging stations, and then over half of their employees ended up buying and now drive electric vehicles to work.
Multiple studies have taken a look at this infrastructure need. So you've got more EVs on the road, people are adopting it more aggressively. What's that going to look like in terms of the charging stations? If you buy a car today, getting to a gas station is not really something that worries you. You can find those easily. Although I've been on the road before and haven't realized the gas is almost running out. So that gave me a little bit of range anxiety. So in this case, planning and thinking ahead will involve really taking a careful look at where will be the demand, and how do you meet that demand? Is it in fast charging stations along the highway? Is it in public spots? Is it in your workplace? A couple of the studies we looked at, and this modeling output in particular is from NREL's 2019 view of the county San Leandro's in, indicates that a large chunk of the public charging is going to be happening at work. a lot of data from other research supports this, because that is a place where people spend a lot of the daytime charging. And as Emma will talk in more detail, it's also time where there's an abundance of renewable resources on the grid. So, that overlap is really interesting. So what we see here is that, we're on the right track. We're looking at EV charging. We're looking at the workplaces at these commercial and industrial sites. And now we want to think about, how do you stack them up against each other? And Erich will jump in now to talk about some of the previous work to ground us on this year's work.
Hey, can you guys hear me? I lost you at the end, Vinny.
Oh yeah, I was just closing up there and saying that you'll jump in now to walk us through some of the previous work.
Thanks. So our project is a continuation of 2 years previous capstone projects. So what DER NetSoft did was they determined 6 commercial and industrial sites that would be ideal for DER adoption. And the first year, they looked at installing rooftop solar and ranking rooftop solar as a DER asset on those sites. Last year, as a continuation of that project, they added energy storage. So they looked at rooftop solar and energy storage in combination to see how they ranked amongst the commercial and industrial sites. To get kind of the ideal sizing for rooftop and solar and for battery storage, they use this tool called Reop Lite, which determines the number of hours that the solar would be discharging, that the battery would be charging and discharging, and how that would work in tandem with the average facility load for the year. And we took this tool and we used it as well when we added electric vehicles as a load, and saw how kind of the rooftop solar and battery storage changed a little bit. What they did also was they came up with 4 categories to rank the rooftop solar and battery storage. And we ultimately decided to follow a similar route, but we combined and expanded on a few of these attributes. So the first ranking was operational. The next was financial and economic, and the third was the environmental benefit of installing these DERs at each site. And what they did was they ranked each category and determined which sites were ideal based on weights and weighting percentages on what value a consumer would want the most, whether they want to reduce their grid GHG emissions the most, or they want to look at the financial benefit of the asset and value that the most. And ultimately, the tool gives you a total ranking score based on what you're looking for as far as which attributes and categories are the most important to you.
So as a continuation from the previous projects, this year we're going to be looking at adding electric vehicles as an additional DER. So in order for us to incorporate electric vehicles into the DER rating index, we're going to walk through the rest of this presentation discussing our methodology using an example site, DER 52. So we ended up choosing this example site because at that actual site in San Leandro, there are already 4 publicly available charging stations. So the other charging stations, we had to use more educated assumptions, but for DER 52, we were actually able to use some real information. So the very first step in the methodology that we used was to determine the electric vehicle load. So for DER 52, you can see that we got some pretty accurate estimates because there were 4 charging stations at that site. So after doing that, we were able to get the annual energy consumption at this site. With the EV load added, we were able to determine how many EV miles these 4 public charging stations were able to charge. And then we also determined the utilization rate of these charging stations using that EV load calculation. So then the next step that we'll talk about later is that we Then inputted that electric vehicle load into the site load. So we added the two together to determine the optimal PV and battery storage size for that site. And then after that, we'll talk about the specific metrics that we calculated, the financial, sustainable, and operational metrics. And those metrics were used to help us develop an Excel tool to rank all of these sites' ability to host their personal DER resources.
Thanks. So as previously mentioned, the first step in our ranking or determining any sort of ranking methodology for electric vehicles was determining what the load was going to be. So we decided to do this in two different ways based on research into current charging behaviors for people with electric vehicles. So the first way we looked at it was employees who would be charging their electric vehicles at work. And the way we calculated the electric load here is based on the number of employees, the percentage of employees who drive to work in San Leandro, the percent of them who own EVs. And then we broke this down into two behavioral categories. There's a percentage of people who charge at home and work. And then there's a percentage of people who only charge at work, whereas the remainder would charge solely at home. And so we added those, we multiplied the percentages of each charging behavior by their average commute or miles driven in a day, and then the electric vehicle efficiency averaged for most electric vehicles currently on the road. And we use this to determine the load for this sample site, DER 52, for the employees who charge only at work, and then the employees who charge at work and home, what that load would be on a daily basis. The other thing we had to consider was for sites that had customers visiting. So what we did was we took the number of customers who would visit each site, we multiplied that by the percentages who had electric vehicles. And then there's also a percentage of customers who have EVs who actually decide to charge at a retail location. And then we multiplied that by the average time at a retail location and the charge speed of the level 2 chargers. And we were able to determine what the average customer charge would be as far as electric vehicles. And then we could add all three of those together to get the total site, employee, and customer charging load for a day. And then we calculated that out for the year as well.
So DR52, the site that we're specifically looking at, is considered we call it a destination site. That means we're both considering both employees and customers charging at this site. So it'll use the total combination of the EV load calculations that Eric was just talking about. So the next step in the methodology, once we determine that EV load, is to determine the hourly load profile of that EV load, and then optimize it using the re-op system to determine the best PV and battery storage size. So as you can see in this graph right here, we determined that DR52, since it had an 80% utilization rate, that means its 4 charging stations are going to be used 80% of the time during the day. So that was between 8 a.m. and 9 p.m. However, there's also a utilization, it depends on the hour. So when it's busier, the utilization rate for the hour will be higher. So typically when it's busier around 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. So then you'll see that right here, this green line, this EV load right here, plus the site load, you'll see that it increases there. So then the re-op simulation was then run again to determine the optimal site loads. So before you added this EV load, these were the best PV and battery system sizes. But after you added that additional load, these became the optimal PV and battery system sizes. So you can see it didn't increase that much, but it did increase a little bit. And you can see here that this PV serving the EV load, because you increased the size of these systems, the EV load was able to be charged by the PV solar systems.
So now we'll step through the methodology for some of the details under our 3 categories. And we'll start with operational, and Eric will walk us through that.
Financial. So I'm going to walk you through kind of the operational metrics that we determined. So the first thing we have to consider when installing any sort of DER or energy resource is, can the utility distribution or feeder lines handle the DER support additions? So the way we did this was by determining two different line ranking schemes. The first one is for load. Can the feeder line handle the additional load of the energy storage system to charge it?
I think we lost Eric there for a second.
Adoption and looking at ideal sites for implementations. So I was able to determine which feeder line was going into each site, and it gives you a load hosting capacity and a PV hosting capacity that is currently rated for the line. So we were able to rank what the ideal sizes were given from re-opt and compare them to these limits. And what we found was that 25% of the sites can actually not support PV without feeder line upgrades, and 7% cannot support any sort of energy storage and additional EV load without any sort of feeder line upgrades. The other thing we had to consider was the DER impact on energy consumption. So obviously, PV generation and energy storage generation will help a site use less energy from the grid, but it's also going to take a little bit more energy charging the battery and charging your electric vehicles. So we had to subtract those from the impact on energy consumption. We also had to compare it to the total feeder line. So we looked at the total energy consumption across the feeder line that was contained all those DER sites. And then we ranked what that site's impact on the total feeder line energy consumption was. So what we found is not all sites see energy consumption reduction. There was a few that had solar and storage sites that had that were really small in terms of capacity. So they actually consumed a little bit more energy on an annual basis. But another interesting thing to consider is, while sites look like they have a huge annual energy reduction, they only have a small impact on the total feeder line energy reduction percentage. I also looked at it as far as a peak shavings reduction benefit. So of the feeder line's peak load, how much is reduced because of the PV and energy storage with the additional EV load? And so I ranked this two different ways. One was how much peak load was reduced by the DERs, and the other was, again, looking at the line as a whole, seeing what percentage of the line's total peak load reduction each site had contributed. And what we found for this is all sites do experience some peak load reduction, but the impact is obviously different in some versus the others. You could thing I wanted to consider was, how do DERs respond in a grid outage event? So the facility resiliency is what percentage of the facility's average load can the DER support? The battery's capacity duration. You go to the next slide, Emma.
Eric, this one?
Yep. And so the overall DER grid benefits are, we have to determine what what DERs can do in terms of resiliency. Can they supply power to the grid? Load, can they supply power or charge from the grid? And then voltage, this was another metric that I was slightly considering, but we didn't have a full chance to adopt because a lot of the charging stations were kind of the same size. So that will be looked at further. Was what benefit can charging do with by changing the charging rates or patterns as far as, you know, grid voltage support? And this is the final overall ranking scale for all the operational metrics that were each ranking category was weighted and normalized, and then the overall operational metrics were used to determine which site would be ideal for DER installation based on the metrics that I calculated. The solid blue line is DER 52, which is relatively high on the ranking scale as far as operational metrics, but it will look a little bit differently when we get to the overall final ranking scheme at the end.
So my task was to identify metrics to quantify the sustainability benefits of adopting distributed energy resources at each site. So this is a look at the definition of sustainability. So sustainable development should address multiple issues: economic prosperity, social equity, and environmental stewardship. And electric vehicles actually do a really good job at addressing not just the environmental stewardship aspect, but the other aspects of sustainability. So U.S. energy security and reducing electricity rates will address economic prosperity due to cost savings and profit. Decreasing city smog will address health issues. And of course, increasing renewable energy and decreasing emissions will address environmental stewardship. So these metrics right here will quantify sustainable benefits for the city to use. So the increase in city tax revenue metric focuses on the ability of electric vehicles to reduce communities' dependence on oil, thus boosting their economy. The healthcare metric focuses on the fact that EVs no longer emit tailpipe emissions, and these tailpipe emissions have particulates in them which can damage a person's respiratory health. The number of trees preserved calculation discusses how a distributed energy resource on top of a CNI site, now that it's a rooftop, is using land that is already used. So you'll save land by not doing that, instead of choosing to clear land to put a utility scale solar system in. The water consumption reduction metric is a result of replacing your facility load with PV solar, having it dependent on PV solar instead of the grid. Because the grid, when you're consuming energy, that grid is also consuming, the plants that power the grids are consuming a lot of water to cool their plants down. So the largest and the most important metric that we looked at was the greenhouse gas emission reduction of electric vehicle adoption. So this metric first considers the avoided tailpipe emissions that electric vehicles no longer are releasing. And a charging station is what enables an electric vehicle to do this. However, the electric vehicle charging station has to get its power from somewhere, and this is from the grid. So the first step of this is in the calculation is that it assumes that all of the EV miles that need to be charged are charged by the grid. However, if you put a PV solar system or battery storage system on your site that is able to account for this additional EV load, you might see that the greenhouse gas emission reduction is actually gains some emission reductions because now the PV is charging the site. So I just looked here at DER 52. You can see that it avoids a maximum amount of 567 emissions, but because the PV and battery completely charge all of the EV emissions for that site on this particular day, it reaches its maximum amount of a GHG emission reductions, which is 567. So some other things that can impact, so if your vehicle does have to charge by the grid, that grid emission rate is dependent on a lot of factors, including the regional grid generation mix. So as you can see in California, the regional grid generation mix means that has a lot more renewable energy on it. So an all-electric vehicle will not produce as many annual emissions as if you charged a similar electric vehicle with that same amount of load on a different regional grid that is, say, similar to the grid generation mix of the national averages. Another factor that impacts GHG emission rates of the grid is the time that you're choosing to charge or get load from the grid. So as you can see, this is from California, the grid emission rate changes every single hour. So it's the lowest during the daytime. So if you align your workplace charging with that daytime, then your emissions will be lower if you have to charge your electric vehicles at the workplace from the grid. So this is just another benefit of workplace charging. So this shows some of the data that we used using the DER sites that we had to really show the different charging scenarios, depending on what time you charge, their ability to reduce emissions. So you can see here some workplace charging sites. They were able to, so if they're charged during the daytime, they're able to result in a higher GHG emission reduction. If you choose to charge in the evening time, there's going to be an 11% decrease in emission reduction potential. If you charge that exact same EV load, but instead charge it at night, there's going to be a 12% decrease in emission reduction potential. So this applies to workplace sites, but even destination sites that charge electric vehicles both during the daytime and a little bit into the evening, there will be a 9% decrease in emission reduction potential if you choose to charge that electric vehicle at night instead. So now we'll move on to the financial metrics with Vinny.
Thanks, Emma. So the way we were thinking about this, the financial metrics, is as with any project, any investment, the owners of the sites would want to know, is this, a net positive to me, or is it just going to be additional costs or something I have to invest? The way we went about creating that is looking at any revenue generating opportunities, taking into account all costs, including both initial costs and ongoing operating costs, to build a site-specific discounted cash flow model to bring a 10-year view of this project, the economics of running a charging station or 10 of them at a site, to see what that looks like. So we looked at annual profits from charging station, considering how you can make money out of it and what costs to you are there. We built in the ability to put in subsidies and rebates. At the moment, some of the opportunities for the San Leandro areas in the county there weren't any programs we could put in, but we built in that functionality for the future. And then we looked at some of the metrics on equipment and installation costs for the EV project. So starting with the revenue, what we wanted to consider is how can an electric station or charging station make money? Three key ways that happens is, first, through electric sales, the actual charging. Second, grid services. So, any way you connect with the utility and benefit that way. And lastly, on advertising. So in terms of considering it for our ratings, electric sales were the only ones that we included. Grid services are an emerging area for this. San Francisco has some programs that are fully subscribed, so we couldn't really model out anything in that way to show what the benefit was, but there are potential benefits there. So if we double click on electric sales, there are three distinct revenue models that are already taking place in San Leandro. So the Department of Energy has a database of all charging stations across the country for electric vehicles. We looked at level 2 charging stations in the city, and you can notice out of the 56 charging stations there, for the ones that do charge, they either charge on an energy plus session fee model, an hourly rate model, so sort of park and pay for the hour, and lastly, an energy rate, which is pretty much a markup on what they buy the electricity for and what they sell it to you. So that sort of covers some of our assumptions on the revenue side. We made the tool be flexible so the site owner can choose. I'm choosing between some of these models. I get to play around and see what that looks like. If we go on to the next slide on costs, we built a view of both the cost to install, so the capital costs, and the operating costs of running this. So on the capital side, main thing there is the labor of putting it together, and second, the materials. On the operating side, looking at both electric and non-electric costs. So on the electric side, you've got the energy and demand charges for your energy bill, and on the non-electric, maintenance and repairs, networking fees if you're plugged into a network of EV charging stations. That kind of gives the full picture of a specific project economics. Now, we looked at DR 52 because we had some view of how many stations were there and a better visibility into the load. So taking a look at that and the assumptions built into our tool, you see that energy only is the clear winner here in terms of revenue, almost making $60,000 a year. And over a 10-year period, it generates about $188,000 in net present value. So that's taken into account, over the 10-year life, let's say, of this charging station we're considering. That's how much value it generates to the owner. One thing to note is that what we were looking at is, as a consumer of the charging station, you can charge at home if you have a charger, plug into the wall, or you could go to these sites and pay for the use. At this rate, at the 60 cent per kilowatt hour rate, it's almost a 3x markup on what you pay for at home. So deploying this will really mean, people are willing to pay for the convenience. And so far in San Leandro, it looks like, charging stations have been charging this much. So it'll be up to sites to determine, if I'm charging this to my employee, where do I want to put this? And that will really determine how profitable you can be, how much of your operating costs, capital costs you're covering for that, on a site-by-site basis. Again, ultimately what we aim to do is hand this over to DRNetSoft so that they can run this on every site they interact with and give those customers a range of possibilities and a range of results they can consider. So if we go on to the next slide, Erich will walk you through how this all comes together in the tool that we put together for them.
So going through all of our metrics, what we did was we normalized each category and then subcategory ranking. So each site is ranked in terms of the operational subcategories and then the financial and sustainability metrics. From there, those were given an overall rating score, and you can play around with the weightings on the top part of the sheet. So if you value one subcategory or category over another, you can determine which ratings or you want to put the most emphasis on. From there, it gives you a ranking of what each site is overall, using kind of the weights that you've given it. And then it gives a final ranking and then a final percentile ranking at the end of all the 68 commercial and industrial sites. So this was our final ranking scheme for all the sites. Obviously, DER 52 ranked well and above all of the other ones. And the main reason is we actually had some real data to use and implement in our methodology. So we were able to determine kind of what the actual number of employees and customers would be. And we actually knew how many charging stations would be at the site. So we could come up with a good numbers in terms of what the charging energy consumption would be and the financial and sustainability benefits of it. Overall, this is a very high scale or high level tool, and what it's designed to do is look for not just San Leandro, but for communities across the country so that the variables can be changed. And our methodology requires a lot of known information as far as employee numbers and who's actually driving. So we used really educated assumptions to determine what we thought the employee headcount would be at each site and how many people would actually be charging, to determine what the number of charging stations would be and what the energy consumption would be at each site. But these were just assumptions that we made, and we didn't have a real number for what the total EV charging would look like at each site, which is why this was kind of skewed one way towards the one site that we did have information for.
And like Erich pointed out, one of the key pieces here is going to be getting at that real data. So a lot of the literature on charging for the workplace involves first an understanding, a situational awareness of what is going to be the demand here and what is the evolution of that in terms of my employees, my customers, who drives EVs, and what is that behavior going to look like. So collecting that site real data will be a first step in terms of future work and building out more results out of this and updating those modeling assumptions to ultimately run the simulation of an advanced energy community. So you've got all the intelligence together, and then you can look at the whole community as a whole and see how you can optimize and like Erich pointed out earlier, using those AI tools that DER NetSoft has been trying to develop, how can you make informed assumptions based on all this knowledge you have on the community's consumption and generation from all these different resources. So ultimately, the aim is to integrate this rating, the solar and battery storage rating, into the DER NetSoft current offering, which sort of looks like a dashboard online that customers have access to, and they work on a subscription model, different types of offerings out there. So what they hope to do is build on from the methodology, the work we've done here, and implement that into their interface and present this to their customers as an additional tool that they can have in terms of managing, strategizing around their energy use, and ultimately making sure they're monetizing as much as they can out of either owning solar panels, battery storage, and EV charging stations. So this concludes our presentation, and I know we've been talking for a while, so let's see if you have any questions.
All right, thank you, team one. Questions? You can either ask it verbally, or you can send me a question through chat, or all of the above. Question for team one.
Rudy, I have one.
Yes, Cheryl, please, go ahead.
Great job, especially under the current circumstances, team one. My question is, are there plans for the model in the future, recognizing things are still being developed, to look at the financials when the charging stations are not being used to their fullest extent? And again, correct me if I'm wrong, it looked like your model is looking at the maximum utilization of those charging stations, which of course allows that site to be, in essence, kind of adding an adder to that, to supplying that service, but that would imply that they're being used to their fullest extent. So does the model account for a minimum usage and when kind of the economics might start to fall apart?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we did build in the ability to put in a utilization rate so that your site, if you know that, we could potentially be charging 10 hours a day, but honestly, really 30% of the time is being used, that could be reflected. Another way to think about it too is building in a calculation on what does it take to break even. So we put that in place too, so you could see, okay, well, this is at the point where we, really on a volume metric, or even like how you charge on the rate, what that could look like. So that's something we considered, but again, we don't really have real data to really ascertain for sure what the numbers are, but that's something we thought about, because oftentimes these charging stations are just sitting there, especially if there's not, enough demand or adoption in a specific city.
Thank you.
I guess from an energy use standpoint, we kind of put some slack in too, whereas when we determine, people charging for like 0.217 of an hour, we kind of said they were there charging for 3 hours, because not, employees don't always have the luxury of just running out and moving a vehicle around every 5 minutes when they, when they're done charging. So there is some slack in terms of the energy consumption, as adjusting for some behaviors, as people can't always respond to the second their car is done charging.
Thank you.
Anything else for the team, for team one? While you're still thinking of questions, just want to point out Emma is our first undergraduate student to work on a capstone project. with her peers who are in the Engg program. And so thank you, Emma. I think it was a dream, the dean's dream to have this kind of collaboration. And she'll be going to an internship over the summer, God willing, that things are open. And Erich is going to go on for an MBA degree at Lehigh after he finishes here. And Vinny is going to Boston Consulting Group in Boston. Congratulations, guys, on your next steps.